Jerry Root, thank you for being here, Joshua. It truly is a pleasure having you. It's one of my favorite weeks to have you here because we get to have so much conversation. I get to see the students engage with you. But yeah, maybe help explain your background with Joshua and how long you've been coming and what you speak about when you come.
I think I've been coming since the very beginning. And then people would ask me who would I recommend would come. And I recommended Chris Mitchell.
Yeah.
And then Chris Mitchell and I both recommended Eric Thomas. And then they stopped asking me for a while because you had two really good guys. And then they started asking me again because I've been coming to Hume every year since 1996.
Yeah.
But it was usually speaking at the what do they call the lakeside?
Summer teaching.
Summer teaching series. Yeah. So and then Emily Marshner started the arts conference, and I was invited to the arts thing. And there have been other things too. I did Christian Firefighters conference up here.
That's right.
Some of these other couples. My wife and I did a couples thing once.
Well, it was fun because you hadn't come to Joshua for years. Joshua shut down for 2 years. I think even before that, you hadn't come for a while. So when Joshua started back up. After COVID, I got to ask you back, and it was special for me, and because you know this, but you were a speaker for me when I was a student, and you left a lasting impression. And so there was a kind of a handful of guys that were speakers when I was a student. You, a guy named Sam Meyer, which I'm not sure if you've ever met.
Was Chris Mitchell?
Chris Mitchell was a speaker, and I knew Chris when he came back when I worked on staff. Yeah. He was fantastic.
I loved him. He was one of my closest friends.
I remember that.
He died too young.
Mm-hmm. But it was really fun to be able to kind of reconnect with you and get you back speaking at Joshua.
Grateful.
It's just the best. But this week you have been speaking, predominantly you've been hitting on, last night we talked about truth and what is truth, how do we define truth, but you're going to be moving into some other topics this week as well. Can you kind of just give us a brief overview of what you've been speaking about?
Well, C.S. Lewis was an objectivist. He believed that there was an objective world that exists independent of his thoughts, and that he as a subject could accommodate himself to that objective world. Truth is not reality. Truth is what I think about reality when I think accurately about it. He was always trying to follow, so we're going to talk about this, his pilgrimage to faith. Yeah. He was always trying to follow the truth wherever it led. So when he's a boy, he's raised in a church, Anglican church, and his mother died when he was 9. And people at the church, well-meaning but misguided, told him, you pray, she'll get better. You don't tell a person that. Yeah. And then he prayed and she got worse. They said, pray harder. So he thought her survival was contingent upon his prayers. Yeah. So he prayed with all the sincerity of a 9-year-old who thought his mother's survival would depend upon us. She died. He said, well, this is a crock. He becomes an atheist shortly after that. But the God he was an atheist about was not the God who is. Yeah. It was the God of the miscommunication that he had gotten from his people at church. But still, he's an objectivist, and he keeps leaning into what is real. And eventually, though it took many, many years and many different kinds of things influenced him, he came back to real faith because he saw the truth is found in the reality that there is a God who exists, who makes himself known both in nature and in Scripture, and Lewis came to embrace that. We're going to talk about that tonight. And then tomorrow we're going to start talking about how you share that with other people, and how can you break into their present understanding, which you know is incorrect if they don't believe in God. Yeah. And yet it may be correct from those impressions of God that they picked up from people that were wrong. Yeah. So I would be an atheist about the God most people are atheists about, you know. Yeah. So we'll talk about how to present the gospel in a way that shows that we can really hear where that person's at, how we can take the conversation down to the place of their deep need, and we can present the gospel in a place where it's likely to be heard.
Yeah. It's ideal, and I don't think we've talked about this, but I always try to get you in this kind of section of Joshua before we go on one of our trips, because in March we go to Los Angeles. We start that trip in a prison, and I think we talked about this the other day, but we start that trip in a prison. And students are in the prison sharing the gospel with atheists, agnostics, Buddhists, Hindus, Muslims, Catholics, people who don't even, some who don't even, believe anything. It's an amazing thing. But then we go to Hollywood, and we go to UCLA, and we get in conversations with students there as well. So really, when you come, you're the first one who is starting to go, hey, this is something, we talk about this in Joshua so much, but when you come, it's, hey, you can do this. And you have so much experience in sharing the gospel, in evangelizing to people. But I think the thing that I've always appreciated about the way that you do it is something that you told me yesterday is finding things in common with people. How do you do that? I mean, I think for me, I always try to find things in common because I feel like I have a really wide breadth of experience, but for the most part, it's kind of shallow. So I can pretty much find something in common with everyone. I think that the students that come oftentimes are nervous or scared to get in conversations. How have you kind of not mastered, but become adept at evangelism?
Perfect love casts out fear. Lather up first in the love of Jesus. Take your confidence in Him. If you're afraid, then you're probably looking at others to give you your sense of security, and you're going to always be misled. Lather up in the love of Jesus. That will also keep you interested in presenting that love to somebody else and the forgiveness that comes with it. That's one. Number two.
Hold on. Say that again. Lather
up in the love of God.
I love that.
And go out in that and minister that. Yeah. But the other thing too is you can ask a person a public question. It's not intrusive. What's your name is usually a public question. Yeah. But if I meet a person, I met a guy once, he was from Chicago. I was in Chicago. I said, what's your name? He said, Peter. I said, Peter, are you from Chicago? He was in Chicago. It's not intrusive. He said, no, I grew up in Albuquerque, but when my parents divorced, I moved to Chicago with my mother. He didn't have to tell me that. Yeah. But whenever anybody gives you an answer to your question, it's more than just a yes or a no. They also give you permission to ask about that. Yeah. And you can go deeper. Yeah. I don't believe we take Jesus to anybody. He's more interested in that person than you and I will ever be. He's there. Jesus said the fields are whited to harvest. People are out there that want to know. He said the deficiency is there aren't enough laborers to go into the harvest. Pray the Lord raises up laborers for the harvest. So you go ask the questions, and then when they give you the answer, you ask questions about that. Generally, you'll find, with Peter, I found that it wasn't that his father abandoned them that made him so sad. It was that he was having troubles forgiving his father, and he didn't like the bitterness that was making encroachment in his life. I know how to share the gospel with him now, to speak to the felt need, how the gospel comes and gives him the power to forgive and the power to overcome that bitterness. Yeah. And I think that becomes important. And then the other one too, what if he would have told me, I grew up in Albuquerque, but I moved to Chicago when I was 12. Just that alone gives me enough. Where were you at when you were 12? Yeah. My heavens, you're on the threshold of adolescence, the most purgatorial period of human development. And I could have said, you left your friends to move to another environment when you were at that tender age? What was that like for you? I could have asked that question, then heard what he had to say, and asked more questions until I find out where God's already tugging at his heart. And then I go to make explicit what God's doing implicitly in that person's life. Yeah. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. I'll give you one other quick example. So I would take Wheaton students with me down to Chicago, and we'd share Jesus with people. Wheaton is a bedroom city of Chicago. You get the train, and you can take the commuter train in, and there's a food court at the train station. And you go there, and there are people sitting there waiting for somebody to pick them up or waiting for the next train to go home. And I would say probably 16 out of 20 people, if I said, hey, I'm here talking to people about Jesus, can I talk with you? About 16 out of 20 would say, yeah. Mm-hmm. If they said, no, I didn't worry about it, I'd move on because the fields are white unto harvest. Let me find where the harvest is. And I remember one time going in, and this was a few years, but maybe 3 years ago now, and I said to this guy, what's your name? He said, Daniel. I said, wow, Daniel. I said, I'm here talking to people about Jesus. Can we talk to you? And he says, I'm Jewish. I said, that's how Jesus started out. And he started laughing, so okay. And then I said, what's your name? He said, Daniel. I said, do you know what Daniel means? He said, no. I said, it means God is my judge. He said, listen, you're not going to get anywhere with me. And he said, besides, this is our high holy day. And I said, what high holy day is it? It was a Friday. Mm-hmm. He said, it's Yom Kippur. I said, Day of Atonement. Do you believe your sins have been atoned for? And he said, listen, you're not going to get anywhere with me. I'm not going to change. I said, yeah, you are, because you already have changed. He said, what do you mean? I said, if this is Friday and it's Yom Kippur and you're not in temple, you've already changed. You've walked away from your faith. And he said, you got me. So now we start talking.
Yeah.
I said, you're in Chicago. What are you doing here at the train station? Public question.
Yeah.
He said, I'm a playwright, and I just came in because I was doing work in my office. Playwright? Wow, what makes for a good play? You've got to have human struggle.
Yeah.
Because humans are conflicted and so on. So we started talking about that. We got to the sin issue pretty quick from there. It was easy, and it was a part of the conversation. 20 minutes he talked with us. When we were done, and I explained the gospel to him, he said, I got to catch a train. He totally forgot about his time. I said, what's your middle name, Daniel? He said, Joshua. I said, Joshua means God is salvation. Your name is the gospel. God is my judge, but God is my salvation. And he just freaks out. He goes on his way. So good general knowledge helps, because like you said, you got a wide range of places where you could connect. That's good. But if you can't, then you can still connect by asking good questions.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I feel like I could just listen to you share stories about evangelism. I mean, we're not even going to hit it here, but the conversation you had with a guy, you brought a book to an island in Ireland, or that's a whole nother thing.
Yeah.
Maybe next year we'll talk about.
I'll talk about that tonight with the kids.
I love that story, but we always end up getting into something that I love that you've brought. I've had for years. I print out a new copy almost every year, but that's your reading list. So the Jerry Root.
Those aren't all the books I've read. Those are the books I go back to.
Yes,
and reread.
I mean, here I've got them double-sided the whole way, but I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot. And there's
I'm
one
old,
person.
so I've been at it for a while.
You have been at it for a while. If you had to choose, this is, I know I kind of told you that might be tough, but if you had to choose 5 authors from this list, and maybe a work that you really appreciate, which there's a few I've pulled off of mine recently, my small group's going through A.W. Pink, Attributes of God.
Yeah, it's a good book.
It's a great one, but one we always come back to, Boethius. Obviously you are an expert in C.S. Lewis. You have a whole page of just C.S. Lewis on here. On the spot, 5 authors.
Yeah, I couldn't pick 5 books. I'd have to pick authors.
Yeah.
And of course, Lewis would be high on that list. But then Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. He's going to take you to other authors. And in my own experience, I've greatly appreciated Plato. I've read all the 29 dialogues, and they're very helpful to me. And he was obviously before the time of Christ, but there's many ideas that he has that are far afield from Christ. But there are many that are suggestive. You realize Plato was a big influence on Augustine's theology, just as Aristotle was a big influence on Thomas Aquinas' theology. So Plato and Aristotle, I like the classics. Classic philosophers are really good. Pascal was another one. My older brother was really smart. He died at 48. It was just sad to me. But in college, he was always talking about the great books of the Western world. So one of the few times I was in the library when I was in college, I went up to the great books and I was looking at them. And I saw volume 33. That was my jersey number. So I pulled it off the shelf. It was Pascal. I've had a love affair with Pascal all my Christian life. And I've read him over and over and over again. So Pascal would be another one.
Okay.
You mentioned Boethius. I think Boethius is a significant author. He was an author who C.S. Lewis said in The Discarded Image, after the Bible, was the most influential author on medieval thought. And if you go read Chaucer, he has one character in Troilus and Cressida, Pander, who basically recounts the entire argument of Boethius. Milton's referring to him. Shakespeare refers to him. Dante refers to him. All these authors are referring to him. He was so significant. I think the Enlightenment drew a curtain across medieval thought and classical thought. And it's unfortunate. And I remember talking to Mortimer Adler one time, and he said he thought the Enlightenment philosophers were ignorant men. And I said, what do you mean? I think they were geniuses. He said, I'm not saying they were unintelligent. They were ignorant. I don't think any of them read more than 2 generations before their own time. If they would have read some of the earlier thought, they wouldn't have made the mistakes they made in their philosophy. That's Mortimer Adler, the eminent philosopher who was at University of Chicago, who came to faith at the end of his life, last 20 years of his life. So I've given you Boethius, Pascal, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine would be the
Augustine.
next one.
Yeah.
You know,
That's quite the list. Okay,
Yeah.
let me ask you this.
those are fountainhead authors.
Yeah.
Who influenced so many others. I mean, I would say could put Calvin in there too,
Yeah.
and so on. But
Yeah.
that's where I go.
All right, I'm going to have you choose some C.S. Lewis books. I know I like the quote you always say is Lewis opens more than wardrobe doors. He leads you to a lot of these authors.
Yeah.
I think Boethius in what was the book that you just said that he talks about Boethius in? I think you have a quote as well.
The Discarded Image.
Discarded Image. Okay.
Yeah, it's Lewis. These were lectures Lewis gave over a 29-year period of time in Oxford. Every 3 years he'd do this lecture series. They were called the Prolegomena Lectures to Medieval Thought. He would read all these authors. He would see the particulars, and then he would abstract from them so he could get general ideas of what the medieval mind was like, and so on. And that book is a very helpful book to me. I've enjoyed it, and it's opened up doors of other books I've read because of it. But so I would have to say within genres. When I would teach a Lewis course, I would give the kids, they had to read 9 Lewis books.
Yeah.
And I would say, you need to read one of his literary critical works. You need to read one of his Narnia books. You need to read one of his books in apologetics. You need to read one of his satires. You need to read one of his, and we would go down the list, and they could pick one from a category. I knew all the books well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it all right here. I mean, there's probably all 72 here. But if you were to pick
a category.
all right, I'm going to give you literary criticism.
I think his mature literary criticism in a book that's very accessible is Experiment Criticism. It came out in 1960, just 3 years before he dies. This is the ripe fruit of all of his years of literary studies. But it's how to analyze a book, how to think critically about a book. It's a very good book. And he said, in coming to understand anything, we must reject the facts as they are for us in favor of the facts as they are.
Yeah.
In the epilogue, he says, my own eyes are not enough for me. I would see what others have seen. I would read what they've written.
Yeah.
Even that's not enough for me. I would read what they've imagined. Even that's not enough for me. I regret that the brutes could not write books. Gladly would I see how the world came, presenting itself to the eye of a mouse or a bee, or how it came charged to the olfactory sense of a dog. This is a guy who's curious and wants to grow and know, and that book helps me with that. But if there was other literary critical works, I would read The Discarded Image. I think that's good. The Allegory of Love was the book that established him as a great literary critical scholar. There was a guy, Norman Cantor, who wrote a book on reimagining the Middle Ages, and he talked about the 20 most important literary critical scholars of medieval literature. He's got Tolkien and Lewis at the top of the list, and he's got Lewis at the very top. And The Allegory of Love was a book he said established him. But it's a sophisticated book. If you just picked it up and read it, you'd probably have troubles with it. It assumes you've got some background in that literature.
So the top one, you'd say Experiment in Criticism.
I would start there.
Start there.
It's only about 150 pages.
Okay, well, actually, we're not going to go through all of this because I am going to have you pick one of fantasy.
Fantasy, one of his Narnia books. You know, it changes all the time.
Yeah.
But I would say The Voyage of the Dawn Treader is the one about this transformational life, not only of Eustace Clarence Scrubb, but even Lucy at the Magician's Book. And even at the end of that book, where Lucy finally hears she's not coming back to Narnia, and she weeps, and she says, Aslan, it's not Narnia, you know, it's you. How can I go on living knowing I can't meet you again? He says, oh dear heart, I live in your world too. Only there I go by a different name. And you've been brought here for a time to getting to know me here. You might know me better in your own world. That's a remarkable passage. And I think there's probably some elements of that in any book we read. Anywhere where you cast your eyes in a world that God has made, you're looking on a call to worship at some level.
But say the quote, because we were talking about this yesterday. You mentioned it in your session last night about the burning bush.
That's Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Every bush is a burning bush and the world is crowded with God. That's a paraphrase of what she said. But Lewis has something like that in Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. God walks everywhere incognito. Our responsibility is to awaken to Him, and even more, to remain awake to Him.
Yeah. My last question for you, and I know we got to start wrapping up here in a second, but Lewis has this breadth of work. From we just talked about criticism, literary criticism, but then he has sci-fi work, and he has Narnia and fantasy. Why was he writing?
Satire too. Great Divorce, Screwtape Letters.
Yeah.
So on.
Screwtape, that book.
Yeah.
That fundamentally changed the way I think.
He's got philosophy of education, abolition of man. He's got Christian apologetics,
So often we read authors and they kind of stay in their lane, right? They stay in their genre and they really do what they do. What inspired him to go, hey, I'm going to write all this stuff, but then I'm going to write children's fantasy that can transcend into adulthood. I'm going to write sci-fi before sci-fi is really that big of a thing. Why was he so prolific in so many different genres? What was going on?
Well, he had a curious mind, as Christians should have, but also he had a gift. He was a great writer. He started out as a poet. His poetry wasn't picked up by anybody, but the poet has to use economy of language. They have to write precisely and so on. So he learned good writing skills during those times. And he was in a literary group called the Inklings, and one of his best friends was J.R.R. Tolkien. And he said he and Tolkien sought to write the kinds of books they liked to read when they were young.
Yeah.
So Lewis had already an inclination towards these things. And then as a Christian, he was very evangelistically interested.
Yeah.
He said, most of my books are evangelistic. And then he clarifies it, and he says, we don't need more books by Christians about evangelism. We need more books by Christians on other subjects with their faith latent.
Yeah.
So that they're looking at things from a Christian worldview and showing how the Christian worldview makes sense of all this stuff.
Yeah.
And so Lewis is curious, he's reading, he's writing, he's thinking, and everywhere where his imagination intrigued him, he would set to work writing.
Yeah.
And he wrote well.
He wrote very well.
He defines things clearly, He describes them so that he doesn't confront us face to face. He looks at things shoulder to shoulder with his readers, describing the thing out here. And then as he describes it, we get captured by it. So that we don't need him anymore because we're intrigued to go. But he not only defines and describes, he depicts. He uses the imagination to show us what it might look like, what might draw us in. He doesn't inflate his use of the imagination by saying, this is it, but this may suggest it. Yeah. And I think that's helpful too.
I like how you explain he walks shoulder to shoulder with you.
Yeah.
That's so much of what we're trying to do at Joshua.
Yeah.
Is we're living life together for 9 months. You're shoulder to shoulder, and we have face to face. But for me, when we're out there chopping wood, shoulder to shoulder, that's when a lot of conversation happens.
I think any student out of high school should use this as a gap year, Joshua. Or if they're in college and they're not getting it in college, or it hasn't captured their imagination, or they're with a bunch of professors who are a bunch of Marxists or something like that, step away for a bit. Catch your breath at Joshua for a year.
Yeah.
And then with this substantive base, go back where you can get the good out of college and not be influenced by the bad.
Yeah, and that's what we talk to students about. You've been talking about it this week, is setting a foundation. You set the foundation. We say it in our mission statement, setting a foundation for a life worthy of the gospel. Everything you do next should come from a foundation of thinking biblically and being able to ask questions. There was a guy when I was a student who came to Joshua, and it blew my mind. I'd never heard this before. But he said, while you're here at Joshua, you should question and doubt until you question your questions and doubt your doubts. And it just kind of it shook me up. And I went, I didn't think that I could question and doubt. I thought I just had to kind of keep going. And Joshua was a transformative time for me. I mean, I became a believer in this program where I actually questioned and doubted for the first time. And I'm thankful to guys like you who came as speakers, because in that questioning and doubting was able to bring me back to a right understanding of the gospel and who God is. So
if you have no doubts about your faith, you're delusional because you think you've achieved omniscience. God is big. I used to say that to Norm Daniels. I don't know if you knew him up here, the artist who was up here, and his dear friend. And I'd say, God is big. He says, no, Jerry. The Pacific Ocean is big. God is enormous. He's big, and we're pea brains.
Yeah.
And you have to have enough hermeneutical suspicion in your life that keeps you curious and growing rather than thinking you've got it all figured out. You can have a sure word, you don't get a last word. The sure word gives you confidence. The fact that you don't give you a last word keeps you in humility, keeps you curious, keeps you in a state of wonder and awe, which is always a good prerequisite to worship.
Yes, and I feel like the older I get, and I'm sure that you will recognize this as well, the more I realize I just don't know anything. And
You know some
and it
things.
leads you back, though. But
Yeah.
it leads you back. There's a humility in that and a desire for curiosity.
Yeah.
And that's what I love that you bring is
You know some things. That's why you're
Yes.
a good leader of this program. You don't know everything. So there's confidence and humility. You hold those two together.
Well, Jerry, thanks for being here. You've got a few more sessions, so those are going to be available on YouTube. Is it okay if I link your reading list onto
Yeah,
the
yeah,
YouTube
you
as
can
well?
do anything
So
you
if
want
people
with
are
it.
interested
Yeah.
in finding the reading list, they can find that there. But appreciate it.
They'll say, I know why he's so stupid. Look what he left off the list.
This is all he read. That's it. Well,
It's not all I've read.
yeah.
It's the books I go back to.
Well, thanks for being here.